everyone to day 5 of Dyknow's Progressive Learning Conference. Hopefully you were able to join us on Monday for our live keynote with Tara Martin, and I hope you've been able to join us for all of our sessions leading up to today as well. We've had some really great sessions with our presenters. We're sad to see the week come to an end, but we are really excited for Jorge Valenzuela's presentation today. So I'm Tiara Lustig. I'm a marketing manager here at Dyknow. You've probably heard this 5 times by now since you've come to all of our sessions, but I'm just going to give a brief overview of what you can expect as an attendee for anyone who might not have attended the sessions prior to this one. So obviously this is the Progressive Learning Conference. At Dyknow, we've really identified that progressive learning is coming to the forefront of education and leading educators as a response to remote learning and technology integration in the classroom. So in response to this, we created the Progressive Learning Conference to dedicate a full week to talking about progressive learning and these different kind of styles of learning and having these conversations with leaders in the industry. So I'm excited for our conversation today. Like I said, at Dyknow, we are dedicated to creating resources and content for educators to really help you learn from educators just like you. So just going to plug all of our content so you know where to find us if you would like to engage with us further. We have our Tackling Tech podcast that is led by Brett, our VP of Marketing. Those are great conversations with educators. They come out on a weekly basis, so we're consistently hearing from new people on what they're doing, mostly in relation to technology in the classroom, but also with progressive learning and other styles of teaching. Our blog is something that I'm really passionate about. We take those conversations, chop them up into different topics, and push them out in more of a written format rather than an audio format, and those come out daily. Our Tech Coach Corner YouTube series is something that I host. Those episodes are really fun to record. I take our guests from the podcast and we talk about, one specific tactic or topic that they talked about on the podcast. So taking a really short video, making a digestible piece of content that you can learn from and take action on in your classroom. And last but not least, we have our Tech Coach Con event series, which you undoubtedly know about because you are attending a Tech Coach Con event today. But we host these events, these digital conferences and summits on a monthly basis. So keep an eye out for our next conference. We haven't announced it yet, but it will be coming up in the next month or so. So we also do have a few exclusive offers for those who are attending today. So I'm going to kick it off to Brett McGrath, VP of Marketing, to tell you a little bit more about those.
Thank you, Tiara. We are really excited for 2 special announcements today. So the first announcement is the launch of the Progressive Learning Partner Program. We have spent the last several months having conversations with unbelievably talented and bright educators from all over the country, and the common theme and thread that is woven throughout those conversations is the importance of progressive learning. We're throwing a conference today to talk about progressive learning, so we're super fired up about it. One thing we realized in this process is that we can't be the only voice sharing progressive learning stories with our audience and our network. So what we wanted to do was bring together some of the best content creators around progressive learning and make sure that we were delivering curated playlists to your inbox on a regular basis. So if you're watching this live or watching this recording, you're going to be the first to know about. As you can see, we've already got some incredible sponsors here that are going to be a part of the program, many of which are presenting here today. So thank you so much for your early support. More to come. And if there are people within your network that you're learning from that are creating a podcast or have a YouTube channel around progressive learning, send me an email at bmcgrath@dyknow.com. I'd love to reach out to them and have them be a part of the program. The second announcement is something that I am really, really excited about, and that aligns with the Dyknow product and your schools in your school's progressive learning programs. So we get a lot of questions about the Dyknow product, whether it's on the podcast or through direct messages. And so what we wanted to do was extend an offer for Dyknow. And Dyknow, just in case you don't know, Dyknow is a student device monitoring software that works in person, in remote, and in a hybrid learning environment. It helps empower teachers to passively or actively monitor devices as the autonomy between students and teachers increases with distance, blended, and all these progressive learning styles that we are talking about today. So we're extending a 30% discount on the 2021 school year for anyone who signs up for that. So you can follow the link to learn more about that. This offer will expire on November 13th, so you'll need to get signed up by November 13th. But if you have any questions, again, you can reach out to me at bmcgrath@dyknow.com. Make sure you get those answered. Without further ado, I'll kick it back over to you, Tiara.
Thanks, Brett. Let's go ahead and get started with some expectations and just going over the schedule for the conference before we jump into George's presentation. So we've had a great week today. We've had a great week of conference sessions and breakout sessions. Hopefully you were able to attend Tara Martin's keynote on Monday. Obviously today is day 5, so I just want to recap what's happened up to today. Tuesday, we had a personalized learning session with Jill Thompson. Great session that you should be able to get some actionable takeaways from. On Wednesday, we had a session on STEM with Chris Woods. And yesterday on Thursday, we had our flipped learning session with Eric Geis, Kyle Nemus, and Nick Johnson, otherwise known as Treefish EDU. Check that one out. It's a really good one. So today we're jumping into SEL and PBL to close out the week with Jorge Valenzuela. Expectations for what you can expect during today's session as well as following the session. Obviously, you are watching a recorded session right now. These session recordings will be available to everyone who was not able to register following the conference. So on Monday, 9/28, these will be available on our YouTube channel for you to watch and consume on your own time. Because you are watching a recording now, we wanted to replicate the live conference experience as much as possible. So we will be hosting 2 Twitter chats throughout the day. We have one starting at noon and one starting at 4 p.m. Eastern time. These will go from about 30 to 40 minutes, and we've to lead you all through a discussion while you're watching the presentation. So that will be happening in the hashtag Dyknow PLC. Feel free to use that as well throughout the conference if you're watching this on your own time outside of those windows when our Twitter chats will be happening. We'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, anything you want to share relating to SEL, PBL, and equity and George's presentation. We've encouraged all of our presenters to really use this hashtag as well. So I'm sure if you have any questions for George, he'd be happy to answer those in that Twitter hashtag. And then last but not least, I am sure everyone who's attending today is hoping to get professional development credit for this hour of PD. So we will be providing a certificate of attendance to everyone who has attended either a breakout session or the live keynote. So you will receive an email on Monday, and that will have the link to all of the recordings as well as a link to the certificate you attended one session. Those will be self-reported hours, so just tick off which ones you attended, and if you need additional confirmation of how long you attended for, I'm happy to provide that. Just reply to the email that has the certificate or email me directly at tlustig@dyknow.com. All right, I think that is all I have to cover today. I know it's a lot, and everyone's probably heard it before in the other breakout sessions. So today we are talking with Jorge Valenzuela. He is going to be presenting on how to make remote learning engaging for students by focusing on equity, SEL, and PBL. So George, I'm going to give a brief intro to you before I pass it off to you. Jorge Valenzuela is an education coach, author, and advocate. He has years of experience as a classroom and online teacher, a curriculum specialist, and a consultant. His work focuses on improving teacher preparation and project-based learning, computational thinking and computer science integration, STEM education, and equity-based restorative practices. George is an adjunct professor at Old Dominion University and the lead coach at Lifelong Learning Defined. His book, Rev Up Robotics, Real-world computational thinking in the K-8 classroom, is available from ISTE. George, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Encourage you to turn on your audio. We're happy to have you today. I'm going to pass it off to you for your presentation, and feel free to get going.
Yeah, so thank you, Tiara. You kind of said all the stuff I had to say about myself, and I appreciate that. So, as Tiara has stated, the name of my presentation is Make Remote Learning Engaging for Students by focusing on equity, social emotional learning, and project-based learning. As stated previously, my name is George, and I'm an education coach, author, and advocate. and your featured speaker here today on Friday. And also, before we start, I would like to just highlight a few important parts of my work. I have 17 years of experience as both a classroom, an online teacher, as a district administrator, and now as an education coach, author, and advocate. And in my current context, as Tiara explained, I'm an online teacher at Old Dominion University in Virginia, and I'm the lead coach at Lifelong Learning Defined. And so these are some of the topics that I coach educators in from all over the country and also now internationally. They're instructional designs, computer science and computational thinking integration, emotional intelligence, SEL, PBL, and remote learning, among other things. And for this purpose, I have been to 25 states and over 70 cities in the United States. And now I'm virtually. I'm a published researcher in the Journal of Computer Science Integration. And as stated, I'm the author of Rev Up Robotics through the International Society for Technology Education, or ISTE. And so our session is going to align to the ISTE standards for educators in the topics of learner, equity leader, facilitator, citizen, and designer. And I will definitely point these out as they're addressed. And also, I want to point out that as educators, we already know it's not only about using the ISTE standards to augment our online lessons. We need to align our work to the ISTE standards, our academic standards, and now the SEL competencies, which I will address shortly. And here are a few questions that we can ask ourselves when we're making this alignment between the three. So please take a moment and look at the table in the slide. And I want us to be aware that you can play this back if you didn't catch everything, okay? But this is an important table because it shows alignment between standards, okay? Educators everywhere, not just in the United States, have had a lot of questions about this new school year. And so what we know is that our school year is a mix of both in-person and remote learning. And some parts of the country are actually remote learning the entire year, like in California. And so, you know, this is for several reasons due to COVID. It's for helping attendance, it's for protecting staff and students, it's for social distancing, but most importantly, it's really about focusing on the academic outcomes of all learners. And so when the pandemic initially started, it really, what it did with remote learning was an emergency response to the pandemic. However, now it looks like it's here to stay. And that's why our organization, Dyknow, has made this PD opportunity and this virtual summit. So I want to give Dyknow a few snaps for having this for all of us and for inviting us. And so our session is going to focus on instructional design topics for your project design and implementation, but also some EdTech tools. So instructional design is going to focus on equity, social emotional learning, and of course the academics. And on the bottom of the slide there are the ISTE standards that will be addressed, or are aligned, I should say. So there's many hot topics in education reform, and ESSA is one of them. ESSA is the Every Student Succeeds Act, which replaced No Child Left Behind, and was signed into effect by our former president, Mr. Barack Obama, in 2015. And so I want you to, for a moment, look at ESSA at a glance. So take a moment and look at this slide. Just scan it for a moment. And don't forget, you can play this back later. Now, I want us to focus on the purpose of ESSA, and it's for improving the academic achievement of disadvantaged students, which include students in poverty, minorities, exceptional education students, and English language learners. And I want you to look at the accountability requirements for ESSA for a moment. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because educators need to think about local and federal policy when aligning their lessons and when creating lessons. And school leaders need to think about policy when aligning initiatives in either schools or in districts. And so as I see it, schools need to really align three major things. Number one is policy, as we just saw. Number two are the needs of the workforce. And number three are good teaching practice. And so it's not always easy to align these three things. However, these are a few items for consideration, and it's how I'm going to structure our session. So based on what we just saw, it's easy to see that we can leverage policy. In this case, is ESSA, which schools in the United States have to adhere to for equity. So let's define equity for a moment. According to the Center for Public Education, educational equity is only achieved when every student receives everything he or she needs in order to be successful. And typically, when we talk about educational equity, here's the graphic that we show our educators. And I know that this is an old graphic and it does get some pushback, but for our purposes, I want us to focus on the fence. And I want us to think of the fence as a barrier. It could be a systemic barrier or just a barrier to the kids. And so a lot of people say, well, let's get rid of the fence, like we see here. And I understand this, but it's not always that easy. And let's say we did remove the fence, right? Those who are supposedly liberated are still only spectators and not participants in the game. And so it's important not just to remove the fence and, metaphorically speaking, and give everyone a device or give everyone everything that they need. You see, the fence or the barrier has caused inequities, and the inequities have caused disadvantages and traumas. And so as educators, we need to understand the consequences of the inequities, and then we can help our students. So let's look at educational equity for a moment.
Across the country, states are raising academic standards for all students to make sure they're ready for college and the workforce when they graduate and can compete with students around the world. High, consistent standards motivate students to succeed, but every child needs something different. Some need help with reading or spelling. Others struggle with fractions. And some are great writers, but struggle with algebra. Every child deserves the best education we can give them, but too many students do not have what they need to succeed. Incredibly, about 40% of school districts in America don't even offer preschool. Almost 1 in 5 African American students and slightly fewer Latino students attend dropout factories. In many states, students of color and English learning students are more likely to attend schools with high percentages of inexperienced teachers. Students with disabilities make up 12% of all high school students, but only 2% of the students who take an AP class. So it's not surprising that there are achievement gaps between white students and students of color, and between students with and without disabilities. But we can change this. We can give every child a fair chance, making sure all schools have the resources they need to help all of their students succeed. And that means providing additional resources for students who are struggling. Let your state and local elected officials know that you support high academic standards and want them to be implemented in a way that ensures every child succeeds.
So let's get really current in regards to inequities. The coronavirus spotlighted inequities, not just in our country, but all over the world, and impacted every aspect of family life, like childcare, healthcare, employment, transportation, and access to food. And for a moment, I want us to look at the second bullet. According to the World Food Program, in 2019, an estimated 310 million children, and I fact-checked this data, 310 million children from low-income families were being fed at their school. I want us to close our eyes for one moment And I want us to think about our students from low-income families and think of the implications of this. Think of what they went through at the beginning of the pandemic, and not just them, their families. Also, I want us to imagine that they were our own children, our relatives, our siblings, our friends. And now I want us to open our eyes and look at the last 3 bullets, where you're going to see the inequities for low-income families due to lack of technology and digital platforms. Please take a moment to view those. Okay, and as a reminder, we can always come back and we can look at this later. And so focusing on equity is good for all kids, okay? It's not just for helping one kid or for a group of kids, it's all kids. And so that is what I'm trying to highlight here, that focusing on equity is going to help everyone in the school. And there is an intersection between equity and SEL, which is why I highlighted equity. Because before we can help our kids with social emotional needs or learning, we have to understand what plagues them socially first and how that has created that lack of understanding or that inequity. And so we can't really have one without the other. And so here are some benefits of SEL in schools. Please take a moment to scan this slide. Okay, and these slides will be made available through Dyknow afterwards, so you can always go back and look at these and share these with your colleagues. And so I love to start this conversation with a personal story. I am the father of 2 young people. They're not so young anymore. My daughter turns 18 next month, and my son just turned 15. And so I think it's important for educators to understand that SEL is not just for the young people, it's also for us as well. And so about a couple of years ago, our relationship started to change, and people that have teenagers know exactly what I'm talking about. My 2 children started to pay me no never mind. So what that means is that when I would talk to them or lecture, as they say, they would start to roll their eyes, look the other way, and at times I would get some sass. And so being a reflective educator, I understood that there were some learning gaps that I had, and there were some strategies that I needed to learn and implement if our relationship was going to improve as they got older. And so I was reading an article by Dr. Travis Bradbury about making first impressions. And in the article, he talked about his book, Emotional Intelligence 2.0, that he co-wrote with Gene Greaves. And in the book, there's an EQ, or emotional intelligence appraisal, which I took online, and I scored between 70 to 79%. And so I realized that I had some work to do. And so that's my personal story with SEL. However, before we get into what it can look like remotely, let's see what SEL looks like in schools.
Social emotional skills are the essential skills for success in school, work, and life. Social emotional learning centers their mind and body. It reduces their emotional tension so they can be open to new content and material. We find that academic outcomes increase exponentially when students are nurtured, loved, and cared for, that we get much more out of them when we first address social emotional needs. So for us, it's actually an academic intervention and not just an emotional one. If we expect students to be college and career ready, it's important for us to focus on these skills and competencies: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making.
The Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL, really defined SEL over 2 decades ago. and have stated that the purpose of SEL is to help learners of all ages really develop these 5 core competencies. And they are self-awareness for self-management, social awareness for relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. And each of the competencies have their own set of skills. Please take a moment to view this slide. And there's a lot here. And so we are going to focus on the basics in a moment, but I want you to see the importance of SEL. And don't forget, we can come back and we can rewind this, and we are going to provide you through Dyknow all the videos and the resources that are in this session, including a PDF of the slides. Okay, so we'll continue in the interest of time. And so the first thing that I love to do first for putting these things into perspective are empathy maps. Now, an empathy map is an equity-based strategy that can be used by educators to put themselves in the shoes of their learners. And we do this by identifying their goals, what they are good at, and their academic, SEL, and career needs. And here is an example of a completed empathy map. And the empathy map helps us to identify the right supports for all our students in our lessons. It's a very powerful tool, and I'm going to provide you a PDF of this so that you can use it for your own lessons and also with your colleagues. And here's a couple of reflection questions that if you're doing a PD, like this one, either on your own or with your colleagues, you can use these. How can I use an empathy map to inform future lessons? And how do empathy maps help us with equitable teaching? And part of the work that I do with schools is that I coach educators through this process. And now we are going to get into social and emotional learning, which is self-awareness and self-management. And so there are some skills here that are the basics, but for our session, I want us to focus on labeling emotions. And so labeling emotions is a critical first step because learners of all ages need to identify exactly what they're experiencing internally, okay? And that so they can find strategies for self-management so that they can come back to peace. Let's face it, we do our best work when we're at peace. And so for this purpose, I love to use Plutchik's Wheel of Emotions because it simplifies emotions for learners of all ages and helps them realize that there's 8 basic emotions like anger, anticipation, joy, trust, fear, surprise, sadness, and disgust. And this is a very powerful realization for them because they learn that the emotions that they experience are the amalgamation of the 8 main ones and also other ones. So please take a moment and look at the wheel. And don't forget, we can play this back, and this will be made as part of the resources after the session. And so once my kids are comfortable with labeling emotions, I use an emotions check-in like you see here via a planner. And so in the classroom, I would do this on the whiteboard, but remotely, I would do it through an LMS or through a digital platform. I like Nearpod, which I'll show you guys in a moment. Now, when I do this with my learners, it's not always filled out like you see here. Here, for the sake of modeling, I have identified either a product, an assessment, a skill, or a new concept that my learners have to master. And I've modeled this for each of the content areas. Now, in the second column, I've identified an emotion from the wheel that a learner may experience. And in the final column, I've identified strategies that either I can model, or I can show them a video, or I can bring in another person to model so that they can self-manage and come back to peace. And so this is where the check-in can live in the context of a weekly lesson plan. So let's start here at the first column. Here, I've identified a product that my kids have to make for that week. And because I'm a computer science educator, they have to make a computational artifact. In the second column, I've identified each of the learning goals for that week, which are 3. And what that means is this: when they master each of these learning targets, then that will result in the finished product. Now, the check-in can be a formative assessment or a check-in that I do with them each day in regards to either the learning target or the final product. And the SEL strategies that we've identified in the final column here of the planner would be taught here as an instructional lesson or a scaffold. So take a moment and check that out. And that is from PBL Works. That's from the Student Learning Guide. And I will make that available as well for all of you, so you can use this as a template. Okay, now when I'm doing this remotely, I do it in Nearpod. That's my preference. However, you can use another platform like Schoology, Seesaw, even Google Docs. And what I do is this: I start with saying, hey, we have to take a quiz. What are you experiencing? Then they label their emotion from the wheel. For smaller kids, you can use emojis. And then together we find a strategy that they can use for self-managing. And in remote learning, this can be done in a breakout room, like in Zoom or Microsoft Teams, Ring Central, or in GoToMeeting. And this is so that there's some privacy. So let's recap our steps using the emotions planner. The first thing is we introduce the check-in. Then the kids label their emotions, and then together we come up with a strategy. Now, once they have a strategy that's in their toolbox, then they can use that when they experience the same emotion on a later day. It's very powerful. And here's an article that I wrote explaining all of these steps, and it's through Teacher to Teacher. And a link will be made available for all of you so that you can access it. And you can also see other examples of the planner in use. And here's some reflection questions that we can think about as you start to use this. And also if you're doing a PD with your staff. Okay? And we can play this back if we want to. Okay, so now we are getting into social awareness for relationship skills. And so here are the basic skill sets that are associated with social awareness. So before we get into what that can look like remotely, let me show you what that looks like in schools.
The social awareness is about embracing diversity, showing empathy for others. Activities might include service learning projects, addressing social justice issues. Role playing is a great opportunity for students to address how a person might have felt in a conflict on the playground.
We're going to see if other people have had some of the very same experiences around bullying that we've had.
You're in my boat if you have a bully now.
Wow, I see a lot of people.
Relationship skills are important in project-based learning. It's the ability to work cooperatively with someone to resolve conflict. It's the one skill you need your whole life. You may not need calculus tomorrow, but you have to know how to work in a relationship, whether it's for a coworker or a life partner. You have to know how to handle conflict and how to handle challenges.
Sometimes at recess, Maya would come over and just start talking about us and saying mean things.
Is it your job to make Danae's job at school hard?
I know it's a form of bullying, and sometimes I'll say sorry to her.
So you choose to be someone's ally and make a better choice.
Yeah, so when it comes to social awareness, it's a lot like self-awareness. We have to have our kids label their emotions. And the purpose of this is so that they know exactly how they are showing up emotionally in social interactions. So you can use the wheel again. And here, in the planner, I've identified two very different but difficult social interactions for young people. So one is an argument, and the other is a transfer into a new school setting. Again, I've labeled emotions based on what I would think a young person may experience, and then I've identified strategies that they can utilize for coming back to peace. I want to stress that we can never assume that our young people know how to use a strategy. And so we may have to model those. And I think that that's really good learning for us as well. Again, if I'm doing it online, I love Nearpod. However, you don't need Nearpod. You can use another platform or your LMS, like if you have Canvas or let's say Blackboard. Well, here, I want to have them label their emotion based on the argument that they had. So they label here, and then together we find a strategy. Again, it can be done in a small breakout room, like in Zoom or Ring Central or Microsoft Teams. And another strategy that I want to highlight are learning circles. And so learning circles are very powerful for helping to put everyone back on the same page in a class and for building our community and school culture. And so it can be done in person or virtually. And I have an article that I'm writing right now where I will highlight steps of how to do that virtually. And there's one more thing about social awareness work that I think it's really important for educators to understand. On one hand, we want our learners to label emotions and to have strategies for showing up in a good way. However, we can't really do that if we don't know our students and what is plaguing them socially. And so here are some issues that we see on the news, that we see on our timelines, and that we hear about in schools of issues that plague our students. And so we're not asking anyone to change their way of thinking or their beliefs or anything like that. But what we are asking you is if we say, and I know that we all love our students, and so we have to meet them where they are. And so part of meeting them where they are is to put ourselves in their shoes and understand what plagues them socially. That's really important. And so if we don't do that, then what'll happen is this: we won't have the right language and the right understanding of what they're experiencing internally and socially. And so this will actually do more harm than actual good. You see, really focusing on equities requires us to understand the conditions or the fence, metaphorically speaking. And not just to understand that it exists, but to understand how the inequity caused the disadvantage and the traumas as a result. That's how we help our kids truly for social awareness. And so there's some pedagogies that we can learn so we can improve this. Is trauma-informed teaching, culturally responsive teaching, and restorative justice. And I've put these items into hyperlinks here that you see here. I've put these into hyperlinks and into this article, which you can access and you can level up on your own or with your colleagues. And this will be made available as well afterwards. Okay, so now we are going to get into decision-making, which is the last step of SEL. And so I want to show you guys really quick what that looks like in schools.
Responsible decision-making is considering the well-being for self and others. It's evaluating the consequences for various behaviors or actions. We do this through shared agreements, one-to-one problem solving, or having students debate an issue.
If you were like, hey, Kashida, can I, how much does an A cost in this class? And you like took out your wallet and, you know, was like, $50. Which one of us would be corrupt in that case?
You're the one that's asking for the money?
We're truly teaching these students to be productive citizens. We're teaching them life skills. We're teaching them how to problem solve effectively. We're teaching them how to be resilient.
I think of all the billions of dollars we've spent on Title I and all these intervention programs, and when all is said and done, what do we have to show for it? I think we're trying to teach technical things instead of devoting some of the resources to teach who you are as a person. Once you know who you are, then learning becomes exciting because you've already established a discipline.
And so these are the skill sets that are associated with responsible decision making. And for those of us who are science, math teachers, STEM teachers, or computer science teachers, know that these are skill sets they already teach. However, when we're talking about these skill sets in the context of SEL, then the best way to teach that is through project-based learning. Project-based learning is an instructional approach, is a method of teaching that fosters really good decision-making and also every aspect of SEL that we just covered in tandem with the academics or our career skills. And so you see this especially when projects are rooted in social justice for disadvantaged groups, or when they're helping through a design a disadvantaged group. And so I want to introduce a framework and a model of excellence for PBL that's going to help with decision making and with SEL. So here is the high quality PBL framework. And the framework is a consensus of all the PBL experts in the world. And so they all agree that in order for PBL to be high quality, you need each of these 6 elements embedded into your projects. Take a moment and view that. Now, there's a couple of things that I do want to point out for SEL. If we frame intellectual challenge and accomplishment, project management, and reflection in the context of responsible decision making, then we are able to help our kids arrive at these skill sets, not just in one project, but over time. And so you can download this framework. It's free. It's do it yourself at the URL there. It's available in English and Spanish. And again, this will be made available to you at the end of the session. Now, I want to introduce a model for PBL by PBL Works, formerly known as Buck Institute for Education, and it's called Gold Standard Project-Based Learning. And this is one that I teach all over the country and also virtually because I'm a national faculty of PBL Works. And so the model is built on 2 frameworks, the 7 essential project design elements and the project-based teaching practices. And so I like to call these the what and the how. What needs to go into a good PBL unit and how it should be taught. And take a moment and view these, and we will make an article available for all of you as well. And I want to show you a quick video that really discusses these by Amy Mayer. Check this out.
Project-based learning can be confusing, so let's talk about it for a minute, or maybe more. There are a lot of different teaching methodologies that follow along a continuum. Many of them have constructivist elements. Constructivist means basically that learners learn while doing. Teachers help students to construct their own knowledge rather than to reproduce facts, as opposed to learn and then do, which is generally the model of doing projects. There are also a lot of different organizations who teach specific formulas for implementing project-based learning, like like Buck Institute. According to Buck Institute, there are 8 essential project design elements for gold standard PBL. Even this verbiage implies that there are different levels or types of project-based learning. The Buck Institute tells us that the best project designs have these elements. There are also 8 elements for project-based teaching practices. Here they are. One of the biggest elements of PBL that teachers and students struggle with is students leading more of the learning and teachers becoming guides on the side. This is impossible without building responsibility among learners and fostering the proper classroom environment. But back to our point, are you doing this right? Well, I don't know. Are your students engaged? Here's what it means to be engaged. Are you becoming a guide on the side? Are students asking each other questions? Are they finding information independently? Are they becoming more independent in their learning? Are students learning in a new way? Are you getting any pushback? That can be a good sign. Is anyone uncomfortable doing things in a new way? This can also be a sign of significant change. Are you working more on providing scaffolding and working with small groups than on providing whole group messages? Are you starting to replace traditional learning models instead of stopping class to do PBL? Are your students making choices about their products or processes as they learn? Are your students learning while doing instead of learning first and then doing? The final message is there are no PBL police. If instruction is working, students are learning, they're engaged, then you're doing it correctly.
I really love that video, and I do want to point out that there's 7 elements. Key knowledge, understanding, and success skills are not an element. We don't consider them one, but a lot of people interpret it as an element, but it's not. But it's a great video nonetheless. Our organization has a clearinghouse of how-to blogs, videos, projects that you can adapt, and PBL workshops, and even online courses like the one you see here, which I will be teaching starting in October. And so you can visit our website and you can find out more information on these online courses and on mine, of course, as well, and also find other resources that you can use in your projects. And so that's it for me, everyone. I really appreciate you watching my session. I hope that you found items here that are really useful, that you can integrate into your practice. And also, I want you to follow me on my social media, on Twitter and Instagram at George Does PBL, that is Jorge. And here is the link, or the URL, I should say, to my website. If you're interested in robotics, STEM, and in computer science, I have a book that is through ISTE. And if you use the code Academy, you can get 30% off. And I know that you must be having a lot of questions. You can also reach out to me about those if you'd like. And so again, I want to say thank you. And I really enjoyed putting this all together for everyone.
Thank you so much, George. I think that presentation was incredibly relevant and really just a needed conversation at this point. I think with people going back to school, either remotely, hybridly, or in person, it's just really applicable. I had a few questions. I know we're running low on time, but just wanted to cover off a couple questions, and also just want to let everyone know, please submit your questions to George in the Twitter chats and just using the hashtag Dyknow PLC. I'm sure you'll be happy to answer those questions. I just wanted to ask 2 quick questions regarding SEL and kind of the impact of remote learning on SEL. So you talked about the 4 core competencies. I would be interested in hearing what you've noticed with different schools that you've worked with on which competencies maybe have taken a front seat or become kind of at the forefront of educators' priority lists, or what they're focusing most on during remote learning, and maybe how that is impacting going back to school and going back in whatever environment they're going into.
Yeah, so if you saw that one slide that, highlighted that each of the competencies have a lot of, different set of skills. However, what I'm finding is that in the workshops I'm doing is we're really focusing on the basics. And that is in helping kids with labeling what they're experiencing. It's with self-awareness. And so self-awareness, I think it's really important for knowing how they or we are showing up emotionally in remote learning, in the classroom, in current events, and in relationships. And so the first step is identifying that and then finding a strategy for self-management. And self-management is really just to, come back into a peaceful state and also having positive relationships and making good decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a great response to that question. And then last but not least, you talked a lot about building relationships. And I think that is a theme that's come out in a lot of our conversations with educators during this time. I would love to get your take on both for the student to student relationship and teacher to student relationship. How can we strengthen that going back to maybe an in-person or hybrid setting following this period of remote learning? I know for some schools, they're not going to be going back to school in person or hybrid, but for those that are, how do you transition from that kind of remote relationship that has been had over the past few months and then go into that kind of in-person relationship again?
I personally think that every adult in the building should take a responsibility over 5 to 10 kids as far as the SEL stuff goes. And I think that makes it very manageable and in small groups, and really focus on establishing norms and conversations that are needed based on that school. For example, if my school has poor relationship skills or needs additional assistance in relationship skills in regards to how the kids are getting along in projects, then that should be like the focal point of that adult with those kids. And so when that's done in all of the classrooms, then what happens is this: it becomes part of the culture of the school. You see, we may be siloed in our classrooms, especially like in the higher grades, meaning I teach my subject and my colleague is teaching another one, and so forth. However, our kids aren't siloed. They come to each of us. So if we are establishing the same norms, then that same culture is established everywhere. It's like water. If I pour water here, it doesn't just rise in one place, it rises throughout. So that's what we're trying to do.
A great analogy and great advice. I love the idea of the real effect, especially with culture. I think that's the only way to create kind of a cultural shift, is to start one place and then it grows everywhere. So don't want to take up a ton more of your time, but thank you so much, George, for a great presentation. Once again, for everyone watching, you can access this presentation on Monday on the YouTube channel if you're not able to join us live. And don't forget to put your questions in the Dyknow PLC hashtag to get George to answer all of those. Thank you so much, George.
It's a pleasure.
Awesome.